She made her first kill in mere seconds. By nightfall, they called the human cadet Shadow Fang. Part 1. The cadet who smelled wrong. The chair was too tall. That was the first thing. My feet did not touch the floor. I sat in the orientation hall of Verath Station's Galactic Defense Academy with my boots dangling 2 inches above the ground like a child at a dining table built for someone else's family. Around me, 43 alien cadets filled seats that fit them perfectly. The Kreth, big and scaled and broad across the shoulder, settled into their chairs like they had been carved to match. The Yulani, all soft light and fluid movement, folded themselves down with a kind of boneless ease that made my spine feel like a design flaw. I was the only human in the room. I pulled out my notepad and wrote, "Exits 4, ceiling height, approximately 4 meters, nearest Kreth to my left, about 2 arm lengths. His teeth are the size of my fingers. Fine." The air smelled like copper and something older than copper, something that lived at the back of my nose and refused to leave. I breathed through my mouth for the first 30 seconds and then decided that was worse and switched back. I wrote, "Air quality, hostile but survivable." I underlined survivable. My name is Mara Voss. I'm 19 years old. I grew up in a town in rural Wales where the biggest threat was the weather and the second biggest threat was my neighbor's dog. I had spent the last 2 years in basic Terran defense training, which my instructors described as exceptional and which I privately described as the first place I had ever felt like I was doing something correctly. I was transferred to Verath Station 6 weeks after the ceasefire accords were signed. The paperwork said I was a diplomatic asset. The paperwork was optimistic. The orientation speaker was a Yulani administrator whose name translated roughly to Pale Convergence, which I was told was a great honor among their people. She stood at the front of the hall and spoke in Galactic Standard, the shared language all cadets were required to learn before arrival. My Galactic Standard was functional, not elegant, functional. I understood approximately 80% of what she said and guessed at the rest. What I gathered, we were Cohort 7. We had been selected from a combined pool of over 12,000 applicants across 14 species. The Academy had a 91% completion rate, which sounded impressive until she mentioned that the 9% did not simply fail out. I wrote that down too. Halfway through the address, the Kreth 3 seats to my right stood up. He did not stand the way a person stands when they need to stretch. He rose in one slow, deliberate motion, shoulders rolling back, chin lifting, the scales along his neck flaring outward in a fan of dark green and gold. His eyes fixed on the largest Kreth in the row ahead of him. The two of them held each other's gaze for a long, airless moment. Then the one in front dipped his head, just slightly, and the standing one sat back down. Done, over, nobody else reacted. I leaned toward the small Yulani cadet seated to my left. Her skin pulsed a very faint, steady blue. I had read enough about Yulani biology to know that blue meant calm, or possibly concentration. The literature was not specific. I asked her quietly what that was. She looked at me with large, pale eyes. "Challenge posture," she said. "Hierarchy establishment. It is done at the beginning of any new grouping." She paused. "Your species does not do this." I thought about every team meeting, every first day of school, every new training group I had ever walked into. "We do it differently," I said. She accepted this. Her name was Leth, she told me. She had been assigned as my orientation partner for the first rotation. She also told me, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a medical result, that the Academy's modeling suggested I would wash out within 6 rotations. I asked her what the models were based on. She said, physical parameters, species endurance averages, psychological stress indicators, and historical precedent. I asked what the historical precedent was. There was a pause. "You are the first human enrolled since the ceasefire," she said. "The precedent is limited." I wrote that down. Then I wrote 6 rotations. Then I drew a small box next to it and left it empty. I would fill it in when I was still here at rotation 7. The rest of orientation passed in a series of stations. Equipment fitting, which was a charitable description for 40 minutes of an automated system repeatedly informing me that my measurements fell outside standard parameters and offering to order custom modifications that would arrive in 3 to 5 rotations. Dietary registration, where I listed human nutritional requirements and watched the system flag 14 items as either indigestible or mildly toxic to 7 other species in my cohort. Bunk assignment, where I was given a room in Block C that had been modified for human occupancy, meaning the ceiling light was lower and there was a gravity setting that matched Earth standard. I stood in that room for a moment after the door closed. The light was warm, the gravity was right. It felt, briefly, like standing in a room that had been expecting me. I did not let myself feel that for long. That kind of thing gets expensive. My bunk supervisor was an older Yulani named Vale, who served as both block instructor and what the academy called a species integration coordinator, a title that seemed to mean he was responsible for making sure I did not cause an incident. He met me at my door on the first evening and handed me a data pad with my first rotation schedule. He was polite. He was also, in the way of the Yulani, incapable of withholding information he considered relevant. He told me that my enrollment had been discussed at the faculty level for several rotations before my arrival. He told me that opinion had been divided. He told me that the primary concern was not my academic readiness or my physical capability, but something he described as species temperament variance, which I eventually understood to mean that nobody was quite sure how a human would react to the environment, the training, or the other cadets. I told him I was adaptable. He pulsed a color I did not yet have a reading for and said, "That is what your file says." He left. I sat on the edge of my bunk, which was correctly sized, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about my mother, who had cried at the departure bay and then straightened up and said very clearly that she was not worried. I thought about my training instructor back home, a retired officer named Colin Hart, who had shaken my hand on the last day and said I was the most unnerving cadet he had ever trained and that he meant it as the highest possible compliment. I thought about the Kreth with the finger-sized teeth and the challenge posture and the way the whole room had pretended not to watch. I pulled out my notepad. At the top of a fresh page I wrote Day 1, below it exits, 4 threats unclear. Then I crossed out unclear. I wrote developing. I turned off the light. Part 2, the kill. The assessment room smelled like metal and ozone and something sharp that lived at the back of my throat the moment the door sealed behind me. I was last. That was not an accident. The scheduling rotated by species designation, and humans fell at the bottom of the Galactic Standard Taxonomic List, which itself followed a logic I had not fully decoded, but which seemed to correlate loosely with how long each species had held spaceflight capability. Humans, 61 years, we were new, we went last. I had watched the previous 43 assessments through the observation glass in the corridor outside. I was not required to watch. Nobody else had watched. I watched anyway. The room was a 20-meter square chamber with matte gray walls, a textured floor, and one target drone that floated at head height in the center of the space. The drone was roughly the size of a large melon. It was matte black with a cluster of sensor nodes along its upper surface, and it moved with the particular smoothness of something that had been designed to be very difficult to catch. The assessment objective was simple: incapacitate the drone. Time started when the door sealed. Time stopped when the drone hit the floor. The scoring system was built around Kreth reflex biology. Burst speed, forward pressure, overwhelming force applied in the shortest possible window. The top score in Academy history was 4.2 seconds, held by a cadet named Sorath, who was in my cohort, who was very large even by Kreth standards, and who I had watched achieve something close to 4.5 seconds in today's assessment with the relaxed ease of someone who was not trying particularly hard. He was standing near the observation glass when I passed him in the corridor. He looked at me the way you look at something you have already categorized, not hostile, just finished. The door sealed behind me. The drone's sensors activated. I could hear it, a faint, high rotation in the motor beneath the casing. It held position in the center of the room, waiting. That was how it worked. It waited for movement, then it responded. The longer a cadet hesitated, the faster the drone's response window closed. I did not hesitate, but I also did not charge. I stepped left, one step, weight low, heel first, the kind of movement that takes up almost no space and makes almost no sound. The drone's sensors swiveled toward me. Its response arc began to calculate. I could see the micro-rotation in its body that indicated incoming action. I was not where it was aimed. I had moved again, not back, not forward, diagonal, cutting the angle so that I passed through the edge of its sensor range rather than the center of it. The drone adjusted. I was already somewhere else, not running, not scrambling, just not where it expected. Then I was behind it. What happened in the next moment was something I could not fully explain at the time and still cannot fully explain now. It was not a technique I had been taught. It was not a calculated sequence. It was something Colin Hart had called, in one of our last sessions, the part of you that knows before you do. I had 2 points of contact. I applied force in a specific direction. The drone's motor, which was its only real structural vulnerability, received that force exactly where it was most vulnerable. The drone hit the floor. I stepped back. The room was very quiet. Then the speaker above the door said, in the flat tone of automated systems everywhere, "Assessment complete. Time 1.7 seconds." I picked up my stylus. I had dropped it when I entered, a small fumble I had not anticipated. I wrote down the time in my notepad. I underlined it. I did not know what it meant in context. I just knew I should write it down. The door unsealed. I walked out into the corridor. The silence was different out there. It had a texture to it. 43 cadets who had been moving, adjusting, murmuring in their respective cluster languages were not doing any of those things anymore. They were standing in the particular stillness of creatures whose nervous systems had received information that their conscious minds had not yet finished processing. The Ulani had gone dark, not grey dark, the color of distress. A deep, complete dark, like the light inside them had been held very still. Leth, standing near the back of the group, was the same muted color she had been during the targeting exercises 2 days prior. The color she turned when she was concentrating very hard on something she did not fully understand. The Kreth were doing something with their posture that I did not have a word for yet. Not challenge posture, something lower, something that pulled their shoulders in rather than rolling them back. I had not seen them do it before. Sorath was at the front. He was big. He was, by any measure I had available, the most physically capable cadet in Cohort 7. He had gone through 3 years of Kreth martial conditioning before academy enrollment. He held the top score in academy history. He had spent the entire first rotation establishing a clear and unchallenged position at the top of the cohort hierarchy without breaking what I would call a sweat, though the Kreth equivalent involved a different set of biological responses. He looked at me for a long moment. Not the way he had looked at me in the corridor before my assessment. That look had been finished, categorized, filed. This look was something else. It was the look of someone who had opened a door expecting one room and found an entirely different structure on the other side. He said, "What are you?" Not what species, not what technique, what are you? I thought about 6 rotations. I thought about the empty box I had drawn next to it. I thought about a whole taxonomy of things I had been called over the years, most of them meaning some version of too much or not quite right. I did not have an answer that would fit in this corridor. I wrote down my time. Vale was waiting for me at the corridor junction that led back to Block C. His skin was a color I had started to learn, a pale, steady amber that I had begun to associate with something between concern and recalibration. He fell into step beside me without speaking for approximately 20 meters. Then he said, "The automated systems have flagged your assessment result for review." I asked why. He said, "Because no cadet in the recorded history of this institution has scored below 2 seconds. The lower bound of the scoring scale was set at 2 seconds because it was considered a statistical impossibility." He paused. "The system requires a manual override to record your time." I asked if that was a problem. No, he said, then after a beat, it is a precedent. I told him I seem to be making a lot of those. He did not argue. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the correctly sized bunk and looked at the number I had written down, 1.7 seconds. I held the notepad in both hands and looked at it for a long time. I thought about Colin Hart telling me I was unnerving. I thought about my mother straightening up at the departure bay. I thought about the word Leth had used in the assessment corridor, spoken quietly to the Yulani beside her in Galactic Standard, just loud enough for me to catch. I did not know the word yet. I wrote it phonetically in my notepad so I could look it up. Later, in the Academy's linguistic database, I found it listed under Yulani Pulse vocabulary, classified as an archaic hunting context term. The translation was, the thing in the dark that has already decided. I closed the notepad. I looked at the ceiling. Outside my door, the corridor was very quiet, quieter than it had been any previous night. The usual low sounds of a dormitory block, movement, conversation, the soft pulse of Yulani communication were absent, or not absent, held. I turned off the light. I lay in the correct gravity and breathed the copper-old air and thought, day 2. Then I slept. I slept fine. Part 3, What Humans Are For. The name spread the way all names do, not from the person who earned it, never from her. Leth told me 3 days later. She sat across from me in the nutrition hall, her skin cycling through a series of thoughtful greens, and she said it the way you deliver a result you find both clinically interesting and personally significant. She said, "They are calling you Vithu Soren." She paused. "It is not a standard designation. It comes from a very old Yulani context. The translation is approximate." I asked what the approximate translation was. "Shadow Fang," she said, "the thing that strikes before the shadow arrives." I looked at my food, which was one of 7 items on the Academy menu flagged as human-compatible, and which tasted like someone had described nutrition to a machine that had never experienced hunger. I ate it anyway. Who started it? Uncertain, Leth said. It moved through Yulani pulse language first, but the Kreth have adopted it. She paused again. That is unusual. The Kreth do not typically use Yulani nomenclature. I thought about Sorath's face in the corridor after my assessment, the door opening into a different room look. Noted, I said. I kept eating. The name was the first thing. The second thing was Sorath. He did not challenge me directly. That was not how Kreth hierarchy worked, as I had come to understand it. You did not challenge down. You did not challenge someone below your established rank. It would cost him status to acknowledge me as a threat worth addressing formally. Instead, he did something that I came to understand was, within Kreth's social architecture, a significant and complicated move. He stopped ignoring me. In group formations, his position began to orient slightly toward me, not facing, just angled, the way you angle toward something you have decided to keep in your peripheral vision. In tactical simulations, when the cohort split into teams, he began placing me opposite him rather than beside him, not to challenge me, to see me clearly. I watched this happen over 5 days and said nothing. The third thing was the corridor incident, which was not Sorath. 3 Kreth cadets from the lower middle of the cohort hierarchy, not weak, just not Sorath, found me in the refueling corridor on the evening of day 9. Refueling corridors were long and narrow, and mostly empty at that hour. The lighting was lower. It was not a good place to be cornered, architecturally speaking. They did not announce their intention. They did not need to. They arranged themselves, 1 ahead of me, 2 behind, at distances that communicated, in language more fundamental than words. You are small. We are not. Acknowledge this. I stopped walking. This was not a decision I made consciously. My body stopped, and I let it, because something in the part of me Colin Hart had tried to name decided that stopping was the correct response. I looked at the one ahead. His scales were high-contrast gold-green, which in Kreth biology I had read indicated elevated adrenaline. His posture was forward-weighted. He was ready to move. I did not move. I did not move my eyes from his. I did not shift my weight. I did not perform anything that the Creth threat display system would register as either submission or challenge. I simply stayed, still and present and entirely uninterpretable. I breathed at a rate that I had no control over and which happened, because of how human physiology works under this particular kind of pressure, to be very slow. My pupils, I was told much later by a Yulani xenobiologist who studied the incident report, would have been fully dilated. Human pupils dilate under adrenaline. To Creth visual processing, fully dilated pupils in a creature that is not running and not displaying is a pattern that does not fit any category in their instinctive threat library. Their nervous systems, she explained, flagged it as an error, a mismatch. A thing that should be prey, but was reading as something that had already decided what it was going to do and was simply waiting for the optimal moment. Prey animals panic. Predators posture. Humans wait. The one in front of me held position for 11 seconds, I counted, and then his weight shifted back. 1 degree, just one, but I saw it. He saw that I saw it, and that was the end of it. They left, not quickly, not dramatically. They simply stopped being in the corridor, and I was alone in the lower light with the sound of the ventilation system and my own heartbeat, which was not as slow as I had appeared. I leaned against the wall for approximately 30 seconds. Then I walked back to Block C. I did not write it in my notepad. Some things you do not write down because you do not want to read them back and have to think about what they mean. What they meant was this: every species at this academy had a place in a system. The Creth were at the top because they were fast and strong, and their society had built them for dominance display. The Yulani were valued for networked cognition and collective tactical awareness. Every species had a role that the academy understood, a slot in a framework, a set of parameters. Nobody had a slot for what I had just done in that corridor. Nobody had a slot for 1.7 seconds either. I was not fitting into a framework. I was making the framework uncomfortable. I thought about this for a long time, lying on the correctly sized bunk in the correct gravity, and I tried to decide how I felt about it. Back home, not fitting was a problem. It was the thing that made teachers say potential, but made friends trail off in the middle of sentences. It was the thing that made Colin Hart call me unnerving like a compliment, which meant even the people who believed in me found me slightly difficult to hold in their heads. Here, not fitting was doing something different. Here, not fitting was making 43 members of species that had been traveling the stars since, before my ancestors had farming look at the refueling corridor wall that I had just been standing in front of, and then quietly decide to find a different route to wherever they were going. I sat up. I pulled out the notepad. I opened it to the page with the empty box. 6 rotations. I was on day 12, 2 rotations in, 4 to go before the models said I would be gone. I drew a small line through the middle of the box. Not a check, not a declaration, just a mark to show the space was occupied. Then I turned out the light. Vale knocked on my door at the next morning's early bell. He had a second datapad with him, which was unusual. He handed it to me without preamble. It was a summary of all the official and unofficial incident flags from the previous 9 days that had involved my name, my assessment score, or the designation Vithu Soren. There were 23 entries. I scrolled through them, then I looked up at him. He said, "The faculty review board has asked me to determine whether your presence is generating instability in the cohort dynamic." I asked what he had told them. He was quiet for a moment. His skin held the amber calibration color I had learned to read. "I told them," he said carefully, "that instability is not the correct term. The correct term is recalibration." He paused. "The cohort is recalibrating around a new variable. This is uncomfortable. It is not the same as unstable." I handed him back the datapad. He left. I got dressed. I went to breakfast. The Creth who had been in the corridor the previous night were already seated. They did not look at me, the kind of not looking that requires effort. One of the Ulani cadets near the back pulsed a brief, pale gold in my direction as I passed, which Leth had told me was the Ulani equivalent of a nod. I got my food. I sat down. I ate. Part 4, the night exercise. The briefing came at the end of rotation 3, which by then I had stopped counting in days and started counting in the academy's own units out of necessity. Vale delivered it to the assembled cohort in the main tactical hall, his amber skin steady and untroubled, and what he described was this: a full live exercise on Verath stations, outer ring, actual terrain, actual equipment, competing against Cohort 4, which had 2 more rotations of training behind us and a reputation, according to Leth, that translated roughly into systematic and relentless. Objective was capture and extraction. Cohort 7 needed to locate and retrieve a data core from a fixed position within Cohort 4's defensive zone. Cohort 4 needed to stop us. The exercise ran until either the core was retrieved or every active member of Cohort 7 was tagged out. Tagged out meant your suit sensor array registered a direct contact hit, and your suit then locked your mobility to a slow walk. It did not hurt. It was designed to feel, as Vale put it, conclusive. Standard equipment, no live rounds, no modifications. Whatever we brought in was what we had. I brought my notepad. The outer ring of Verath Station was a long, curved corridor system used primarily for maintenance access and cargo routing. The walls were close. The lighting was operational but dim, the kind of dim that the station's automated systems had decided was adequate for machinery and was borderline inadequate for everything else. The floor was a textured metal that transmitted sound very efficiently. Every footstep announced itself. There were sensor sweeps on a 30-second rotation cycle, which I knew because I had read the station schematics, which were public record, which meant Cohort 4 also knew. The sensor sweeps covered a 70-degree arc centered on the main access corridors. They did not fully cover the space where the corridor curved away from the main trunk. I knew this before we entered. I wrote it down. We entered in formation. Sorath at the front, 2 Kreth heavies flanking, the Ulani network cluster in the middle, me at the back. This was the default formation. I was at the back because I was the smallest and because nobody had thought to put me anywhere else. 4 minutes in, Cohort 4 made contact with our forward team. I heard it rather than saw it, the sound of the Kreth in our forward line doing what Kreth do when they encounter opposition, which is commit fully and loudly. There was a brief exchange that the sensor arrays would have logged as high impact. Then the suit lock signal from 2 of our forward cadets. They had been tagged out. Sorath pulled the formation back 15 meters. His posture was controlled. His decision-making was clean. He was good at this. He was doing everything correctly. He looked back down the line. He looked at me. He had never asked me for anything. In the hierarchy of Cohort 7, asking me for anything would have required him to acknowledge a particular reordering that his status made complicated. His eyes held mine for a moment. Then he said, "Voss, point." Just that point, the front of the formation, the place you put your best or your most dispensable, depending on the situation. I walked to the front. I looked at the corridor ahead, the curve, the dim light, the sensor arcs I had mapped in my head from the schematics, the faint vibration in the floor that meant Cohort 4 was maintaining a position approximately 40 meters ahead. I stood there for a moment, and I let the part of me Colin Hart had named do what it did. Then I moved. Not fast, not slow. I moved the way water moves through a space that has gaps in it, finding the path that already exists rather than forcing one. The first sensor arc swept past. I was in the dead zone of the curve when it hit, pressed against the wall in the exact spot where the arc's outer edge did not reach. This was not a calculation I had performed in the moment. This was a reading. A feeling in my feet and my shoulders that said here, and I went here, and the sweep passed over empty space where I had been standing a breath before. I moved again. Ahead, Cohort 4 had stationed 2 cadets at the junction point, a Kreth and a Ulani working in coordination, which was smart placement. The Kreth for contact, the Ulani for early alert. The Ulani would pulse a warning the moment it sensed an approaching presence. I came from the angle it was not covering. Ulani sensory fields, I had read in the xenobiology module, oriented toward the primary threat axis. They were excellent at sensing what was in front of them. The peripheral field was narrower than most species assumed. I had noted this. I had noted it the same way I noted exit counts and sensor rotations and the particular sound a creth makes when its weight is forward rather than back. The contact was 2 seconds, 2 points, 2 hits, 2 suit locks. The Ulani had time to begin a pulse signal, not time to complete it. I kept moving. The data core was in a chamber at the end of the secondary access corridor, behind a locked panel that required a physical interface rather than remote access. This was the part of the objective that had not appeared in the standard briefing, which I knew because I had read the full exercise specification file, which had been accessible in the Academy's training archive if you went looking for it, which I had, the same evening the briefing was delivered. The lock mechanism was a Galactic Standard Series 7 panel. I had practiced the Series 7 override sequence twice in the Academy's equipment room after evening bell, with Vale's knowledge and without comment from him in either direction. It took me 22 seconds in practice. In the field, in the dim light, with the sound of the exercise unfolding behind me, it took 19. The panel opened. I took the call. Behind me, I heard the exercise shift. Sorath's team had moved on my flank entry, using the opening I had created in Cohort 4's coverage to push the forward line. It was working. The sounds said it was working. Less contact noise, more the sound of cadets changing position, covering gaps that had not been gaps before. Cohort 4 was regrouping. I was already heading back. I passed through the sensor arc dead zone at the curve again. The sweep had rotated. I knew where it would be. I was elsewhere. A Cohort 4 cadet came around the junction ahead of me at speed, covering retreat, and we were suddenly in the same corridor looking at each other from 6 meters away. She was Creth, young by the look of her, which meant in Creth years something different than in human years. She had her equipment up, and her stance was correct, and she did what the Creth do when they encounter something unexpected, which is that she locked for exactly 1/2 second. 1/2 second is a long time. I was not where I had been when she locked. The suit lock signal registered on her suit a moment later. She stopped. She looked at the empty space I had just occupied. Then she looked at me, standing 4 meters to her left. Her face did something I did not have a xenobiology classification for. Later, I would decide it was the Creth equivalent of a person who has opened a door and found that the room behind it does not follow the rules of rooms. I kept moving. The extraction point was the entry gate. I crossed it with the core in both hands at the 42-minute mark. The exercise ended. The final count, Cohort 7 had lost 6 cadets to suit locks. Cohort 4 had lost 9, plus 2 at the junction and 1 in the secondary corridor, for a total of 12. The core was retrieved. The objective was complete. Vale read the results in a flat, even tone in the post-exercise debrief, as though he was reading cargo manifests. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when everyone is thinking about the same thing. Sorath was standing at my left, not beside me the way the cohort had stood on the first day, clustered by species, comfortable in their own groupings. Beside me, the way you stand beside something you have decided to keep near. He did not say much. Sorath was not a creature of many words. He said one thing after the debrief ended and the cadets began to file out. He said, "How did you know the arc dead zones?" I told him I had read the schematics. He was quiet for a moment. "We all received the same schematics," he said. "Yes," I said. He thought about this. "You read them differently." I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Colin Hart saying the part of you that knows before you do. I thought about standing in that corridor on day 9, still and present and entirely uninterpretable, and the Creth in front of me shifting his weight back by 1 degree. I read them like a map of where not to be, I said. Sorath looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once. the nod of someone who has received an answer they will be thinking about for a long time. He walked out. I stood in the empty debrief room with the data core on the table beside me, and the ventilation system doing its work above me, and the copper-old smell of the station air doing its work in my nose, and I thought, 12 days in. 4 rotations. The box in my notepad had a line through it. I thought about drawing another line, decided against it, left it where it was. Part 5, Shadow Fang. The final assessment scores posted on the morning of graduation day, which the Academy called cohort completion, and which involved a ceremony that lasted 3 hours, and which I had been told, by Leth, was considered deeply significant by every species in attendance, except humans, who had no equivalent cultural practice. I stood in the main hall with Cohort 7 around me, and I looked at the scores on the board. First place, Sorath, combined assessment index of 94.7 across all categories, which was the second highest score in Academy recorded history, and which he had achieved with the particular settled authority of someone who had always known this was where he would land. Second place, Mara Voss, combined index of 91.2. I had known it was going to be second, not from false modesty, from math. Sorath was better than me at 11 of the 15 assessed categories. He was stronger, faster in direct confrontation, more experienced in Galactic standard tactical protocol, and had 3 years of formal combat conditioning that I could not replicate in a single rotation. He was, by every measure the Academy had designed its scoring system to measure, superior. What the scoring system had not been designed to measure was what I was better at. The categories that caught that were the ones added during my rotation, after the assessment chamber, after the corridor, after the night exercise. They were filed under classification I had not seen before: adaptive threat response, non-standard approach methodology, species-specific capability index. Someone had built new categories to describe what I did. I wrote down my score. I put it below the time from the first assessment, 2 numbers. I looked at them for a moment. Then I went to breakfast. Vale found me in the nutrition hall before the hall was half full. He sat across from me, which he had never done before. He placed a sealed datapad on the table between us and left his hand resting near it for a moment before sliding it toward me. I picked it up. The outer screen showed the Academy seal, and below it a designation code I did not recognize. I looked up at Vale. "The Academy has submitted your file," he said, "to the Terran Integration Command." He was using the amber calibration color, but there was something new in it, a quality I did not have a Yulani word for. In English, I would have called it careful. This is standard for cadets who complete the program. The submission, however, included a recommendation for a specialty classification. I asked what classification. He told me to open the datapad. I opened it. The header was in Galactic Standard. I read it in Galactic Standard first, where it was a long administrative phrase that meant, approximately, cadets operating outside standard species parameters whose performance has generated a need for new framework. Below it, the English translation field had been filled in by a human administrative officer at the Terran Integration Command, and whoever had translated it had done so with a bluntness that I suspected was intentional. Shadow operatives, humans, combat adapted. I read it twice. Then I read the rest of the document, which detailed the classification parameters in careful academic language. What it said, stripped of the academic language, was this: the Academy had encountered, in my rotation, a set of human capabilities that did not fit inside the existing framework of species-integrated tactical training. Rather than attempt to fit these capabilities into existing slots, the Faculty Review Board was recommending the establishment of a new track for human cadets who demonstrated these specific attributes. The track would focus on what the document called inherent behavioral advantages arising from human evolutionary history, a phrase that I spent a long time sitting with. Evolutionary history. I thought about 200,000 years on a planet that was, by any reasonable metric, actively hostile to the survival of a small, slow, hairless primate with no natural armor, no exceptional speed, no venom, no significant physical advantage over the things that wanted to eat it. I thought about how that primate had survived anyway, about how it had survived not by being the biggest or the fastest or the most armored, but by doing something that none of the things hunting it had been able to do, by thinking around the problem, by reading the terrain for where not to be, by waiting, by being still in a way that did not parse correctly in a predator's threat library, by learning, over generations and generations of hard experience, how to be dangerous without announcing it. 200,000 years of that. And then we built spaceships. I closed the datapad. I looked at Vale. What happens if I take the classification? You will be assigned to a specialist training track upon returning to Terran Defense Command, he said. Your academy record will be flagged as a founding reference for the track's development. He paused. You would, in a practical sense, be helping to write the framework. I thought about boxes, about the empty one I had drawn next to 6 rotations on my first night, with its single horizontal line through the middle. I asked Vale, does it have to be called Shadow Operatives? He looked at me steadily. The naming is subject to Terran administrative approval, he said. If you had a preferred designation, it could be submitted for review. I thought about it for a moment, then I said, Shadow Fang. He held his amber color for a long moment. That is the Yulani designation, he said. I know. He stood, he picked up the datapad. He held it for a moment, and then he said something that I had not expected and that I will probably carry for a long time. He said, when you arrived, the models said 6 rotations. I ran the models myself the evening before your arrival. I wanted to be accurate. He paused. I was certain of the result. I have run models for 40 cohorts. They have a strong record. I waited. I have been thinking, he said, about what the models did not account for, and I believe the answer is that the models assumed the academy was an environment your species would need to adapt to. He stopped. That was the wrong assumption. You did not adapt to the environment. The environment adapted around you. His skin shifted, briefly, to a color I had not seen from him before. I will be updating my models. He left. I sat with my cooling food and the sound of the nutrition hall filling up around me, and I thought about that for a while. The environment adapted around you. I pulled out my notepad. I turned to the page with the box. The box had 1 line through it. I drew a second line, perpendicular, making a cross rather than a dash. Not dramatic, not a ceremony, just a mark. The graduation ceremony was long as promised. I stood in line with Cohort 7 and received my completion designation from the Academy Director, a species I had not interacted with directly, who moved like thought given a physical form and spoke in Galactic Standard with an accent that my translation processor had to work hard to keep up with. The director said, when she reached me, something that my processor rendered as, "Your record is without precedent. We hope you will visit again." I said I would try. Sorath was 2 places ahead of me in the line. When we filed out into the corridor after the ceremony, he fell back to walk beside me. We moved in silence for a moment. Sorath was not much of a conversationalist, which I had come to appreciate. He said what he had to say and nothing else. He said, "Second place." I said, "You earned first." He was quiet for a few steps. "I have been first in every cohort exercise since my first rotation," he said. "No one has ever been close." Another pause. "You were close." I looked at him. "Does that bother you?" He thought about it seriously, which was what Sorath did with questions. He did not answer quickly. He turned them over with the patience of someone who had decided that correct answers were worth waiting for. After a long moment he said, "No, it is clarifying." I asked what it clarified. "What first place means," he said. "When no one challenges for it, first place is only a number. It does not tell you what you are." He looked straight ahead. "Now I know what I am." I thought about that. "What are you?" "The best," he said, "not arrogant, settled. And you are something the ranking system does not have a word for yet." We reached the junction where the corridors split, Block C to the left, Block A where the Kreth quarters were to the right. He stopped. I stopped. He said, Shadow Fang. Not a question, not a greeting, the weight of a name being confirmed. I said, Sorath. He nodded once, the same nod as after the night exercise, the nod of someone who will be thinking about something for a long time. Then he turned right. I turned left. Block C was quiet at that hour. The ceremony had run long and most cadets had gone to the rest period before departure prep. My room was exactly as I had left it, the correctly sized bunk, the warm light, the Earth-standard gravity holding me in its familiar weight. My bag was packed. The datapad with the classification offer was inside it. The notepad was in my jacket pocket, which is where it had been since day one. I stood at the viewport. Verath Station's outer ring curved away below the viewport glass, the maintenance corridors and cargo routes invisible from here, just the smooth exterior of the station, and beyond it the dark. Stars doing what stars do, unmoving or moving too slowly for a single human life to clock. I thought about whales, about weather, about Colin Hart and the handshake and the word unnerving delivered like a gift. I thought about my mother at the departure bay, crying and then not crying, straightening up with the particular spine she used when she had decided a thing was already done and the only work left was forward. I thought about the empty box. I thought about what Vale had said, the environment adapted around you. I had come here to prove I could belong somewhere. That was the honest truth of it, under everything. Under the scores and the assessments and the corridor and the night exercise and the names spreading through Yulani pulse language and the Kreth hierarchy doing something new with their posture when I walked into a room. I had wanted to find a place that fit. I pulled out the notepad. I turned to a new page. At the top I wrote what I proved. I looked at it for a long time. Then I wrote below it, not what I came to prove. I sat with that, the weight of it, the particular feeling of arriving somewhere you had aimed for and finding that the destination had shifted while you were traveling and the place you had landed was not the place you had planned for but was somehow precisely correct. I was not the cadet who had fit in. I was not the human who had slotted into an existing framework and proved she could hold her own within it. I was the person who had walked into a room designed for other people, and the room had rearranged itself around me, not because I forced it to, but because that is what happens when something is genuinely new. I had been too much my whole life. Here I was exactly enough. I stood at the viewport for a long time. Outside, the stars did not move. The dark held everything it always held. Below me, somewhere in the maintenance corridors of the outer ring, the floor still transmitted the vibration of footsteps. The sensor arcs still rotated on their 30-second cycles. The curve of the ring still had a dead zone that an arc could not reach if you knew to look for it. I knew. I always knew. I closed the notepad and put it in my pocket. I picked up my bag. I walked out of Block C for the last time, through the copper-old air and the corridors built for other bodies, past the nutrition hall and the tactical rooms and the assessment chamber where a drone had hit the floor in 7 seconds, and a room had gone very quiet around a number that needed a manual override to record. At the main departure gate, Leth was waiting. She was alone, which was unusual for a Yulani, and her skin was a deep, quiet gold, a color I had not looked up and had not needed to because I had learned it the same way I had learned the corridor arcs and the Kreth weight shift and every other true thing I had absorbed at this academy, not from reading, but from being present and paying attention. Gold meant something she did not have words for. I stood beside her for a moment. She said, "You will come back." It was not a question. It was not quite a farewell. It was a Yulani statement of future fact, which is what they say instead of goodbye when they are certain of a thing. I thought about the classification datapad in my bag, shadow operatives, a track that did not exist until I walked through the assessment door, a framework being built around something the existing framework could not hold. I thought about the box with its 2 crossed lines. I said yes. Then I walked through the gate. Behind me, the station did what stations do. The lights held, the air moved. The sensor arcs completed their rotation and swept across corridors that were, for now, empty. For now. My name, in a language older than my species' first radio signal, meant the thing that strikes before the shadow arrives. I had not given myself that name, I had not asked for it, but I had been living up to it my whole life without knowing it had a word. Now it had a word. I kept walking,